Well, as mentioned, I'm Dylan. I'm an Android developer. I've worked on different projects like Snapcar, Carify. Oh, this one. Oh, this is only for the movie. But if you want me to speak louder, I can. I'm an Android developer. I've worked on a lot of different projects, mostly native. So I know a lot about the Android side of how to create apps. And I'm also interested in cross-platform technologies, like how can you do things more efficiently instead of writing two apps, write it once and run it everywhere, which is like the holy grail for most people, but usually that doesn't really work out. So is this better? Is this better? Yeah. So I've been looking at different cross-platform frameworks for quite a while already, starting with jQuery Mobile way back in the day, and Cordova or PhoneGap, which didn't really offer the things that everybody expected of it. So most cross-platform frameworks are already like, cross-platform framework, no, that's never going to work, or it doesn't suit our needs. But in my research and looking around the internet, I came across Flutter. If it wants to go to the next slide. As the tagline on the site mentions, it's a portable UI kit for creating beautiful apps, natively compiled for mobile, web, and the desktop, which already sounds really great, except a little bit marketing-minded for most people. But it is developed by Google, so there might be something to it. As the time I looked at it, which started, I think, 2.5 years ago, it was still in an alpha production, not really publicly known yet, but they've really stepped up their game after releasing the first version, trying to get it to a lot of developers to get them to work with it. So they are trying to make it more known. As it says, it's from a single code base. That code base is written in Dart, which is also another not big name in the development world. Maybe some of you know it. It's basically Google decided, hey, we have JavaScript in the browser, maybe we can make it better. We'll create our own engine and our own language, which is better than JavaScript, and we'll put it in Chrome so everybody can use it. And that was, I think, 6 or 7 years ago. And since then, that didn't happen, and they actually removed it from Chrome and still use JavaScript for everything. But they already had that language lying around. It was actually pretty good and also already fully featured for doing development. So they chose to use Dart as the language. Funny small pun, Dart, I'm not sure. Flutter. As you can imagine, I'm a huge Star Wars fan. As I mentioned, Dart is a language which kind of looks like JavaScript. Mostly the creators of the V8 engine also worked on Dart, the language, and the engine that runs it. So there are a lot of similarities, but they also try to remove the things that they didn't like about JavaScript. For instance, in Dart you have fully support for types, so everything is strictly typed instead of just run as what you want. And if you look at Flutter and Dart next to all the other cross-platform frameworks that are already out there and compare them with also the native platforms, you have the Android SDK for, of course, Android, and the iOS SDK for iOS. You also have Xamarin, which is created by Microsoft. It's in C#. It's also a native framework that you can deploy apps on. And on the other hand, you have the interpreted frameworks like Titanium, Cordova, which have been used by quite a lot of people, but not really up to satisfaction most of the time. And then, of course, you have React Native, which is based on React, which is also a really big framework and also works pretty nicely if you do for web. You can also use a lot of code for native, but there are still little inconsistencies and things that you need to keep in mind if you want to use that for native. And then on the other side, you have Flutter, which is a framework which is written in Dart, but it then compiles to actual ARM code. So it's a native binary that runs on the CPU architecture that you compile it for. You have also ReasonML, which is the Facebook counterpart for it. It's the next thing in React Native that they try to do. It's basically the same thing. They only use the OCaml language to define it and then compile that directly to machine code. So there are a lot of frameworks already out there, and why should we use Flutter for this when there already are many other ones? Well, if you compare, for instance, Flutter with React Native, which the creators of Flutter already looked at quite heavily for influencing how they created Flutter and how developers should use it. The people that created Flutter, there's an actual team in Google that manages it. They communicate with the community, they support libraries, they actually try to help developers get along. And if they update something, they try not to break things. Versus if you do React Native development and there's an update, it can break your entire build for quite a while until you fix that, just by updating React Native. And all the other things around it, it's usually handled by third-party libraries. So for instance, for navigations, there are like 2 or 3 libraries that you can use to do navigation within your app, but they work all differently and they're not supported by the actual developers of React Native. There's a third-party person that just manages that for you, and you hope that they continue doing that. With Flutter, they do things a little bit different. They have like the framework, which is Flutter itself, and then they create plugins or libraries that you can also use, for instance, for Bluetooth, which are created and managed by the Flutter team itself. So they want to have first-party support for core functionality, which is on most phones, which is a great thing to have if you want to look in a framework and start using it. You want to have at least some confidence in, if we use it, that people will keep supporting it. The Flutter framework is basically a framework that you can use to write your apps in. The first thing that there is, it's an engine in C++, which contains Skia, which is a 2D rendering library, which is also used in the Chrome browser to render 2D. You have a text rendering component, which does text rendering, which is also apart from Chrome, because they already had those things lying around, which were already cross-platform, so why invent the wheel when you can reuse your own technologies? And they also added the Dart engine into the C++ engine, which actually executes all the Dart code that gets compiled for you. On top of that, that is the actual Flutter framework, which is layered in different parts. So usually when you would create an app, you would only interact with the top part, which is the UI part of it. But you can go down all the way to the lowest level and work with, for instance, the Dart UI, which is basically just the canvas on which you draw. And you can draw pixels, colors, shapes. But it's very not handy to do it in that way. Maybe if you would want to write a game, you could do it at that layer, or you can create a game engine on top of it, which actually already somebody did just for the fun of it. So you can hook into all the layers and also change all the layers. So if you, for instance, do Android or iOS, if there's something with the platform, you cannot change the code. That code is already running on devices. So if you have a bug, and you want to fix it, well, you have to go to Google, say, hey, there's a bug, hope that somebody notices it and fixes it, then releases it in the next version of Android or next version of iOS, and then something is fixed. With Flutter, you can actually do that yourself. You can also, of course, push that bug back to the framework, but everything here in this image is packed with your application itself. So all the code that is needed to run the app is actually the code that you ship, which has great advantages, but also small disadvantages, of course, that it's a bit bigger than a normal native application. But usually for cross-platform application, that's already the case because it either needs to ship a JavaScript interpreter with the app or another runtime like Xamarin already also packaged with your app. So the size difference comparing those frameworks with something like Flutter isn't that big. As I mentioned, most of the time you would interact with the top part, which is Material or the Cupertino, which are already UI components that the Flutter team created for you, which you can use as is in your application. The material design is, of course, Google's material design, and the Cupertino are the iOS components that look like iOS components. The way you would create an app, it's kind of similar to how React does it. For the people that are familiar with React, you have a widget or a component, which is just a representation of state in a UI. So you create a widget which you pass in the state into, and then you have an immutable way of showing that. And you can nest multiple widgets into one another, so you can create a whole tree of widgets and then change the state, and it changes your UI, kind of the same way that, that React Native does it. They also looked at React Native because that was already a great, good framework. That why shouldn't we just do it kind of similar like that? Here are some small examples of already widgets, like a tab bar at the bottom, a floating action button, a menu icon, a grid layout. Those are already widgets that are shipped with the framework itself. But that's not what really makes Flutter really great at UI. What they really want to explain to their developers is that you're allowed to go crazy. You can create your entire UI yourself. For instance, if you are like a big brand, you can create all your components in a certain style and then just use that style in all your apps. And they are really branded to your design then, instead of just using the material or the Cupertino iOS look. And that's where the real power comes into play with something like Flutter. You create those UI components once, and then they work on both devices. For instance, if you would have to do that for iOS and Android in a native way, you would create that on Android way and one on the iOS side, and then hope that everything matches the way the designer mentioned it, and all the communications back and forth and getting there, it takes a lot of time. Now you can just create them once and also reuse those through your applications or through your app. It's really nice that the screen has the cross in it. If you work on mobile apps, usually you would want to interface with something like the Bluetooth or GPS, something that the underlying platform provides for you. And a lot of the other cross-platform frameworks already offer ways on interacting with that. Flutter also has a way of interacting with that, which are called plugins, which are basically channels that communicate directly to the native platform. So there's an asynchronous way of communicating down to the Android side or down to the iOS side, saying, hey, give me a GPS location, or hey, give me a Bluetooth signal or data. And that gets sent back to the application that you built in an asynchronous way.
Yeah.
So how about the platform-specific APIs, like Google Wallet and stuff?
Um, I don't think that Google Wallet has a plugin already. I know, for instance, Square, they've created a plugin for the cash registry payments for both iOS, which basically just hook into their existing libraries that they already had, and then bridging the gap between those. But you could do something like that yourself, or you could look for a plugin that already does that. You can also, every time that something still needed to be done in the native side, you can do that. There's no problem in just opening a new native screen and doing stuff there and just going back to the app that you created in Flutter. So there are different ways, different approaches that you can use in that sense. Yeah, as I mentioned, Flutter has these widgets. This is a basic example of how a widget is written. This is a stateless widget, meaning that once it's created, it doesn't change its structure or it doesn't change its data anymore. This has a big advantage that they can be cached, for instance. So the underlying framework already handles caching UI components for you, so that if you change only a part of the UI, only that part has to be changed and the rest can just be redrawn because it's still the same. And it's basically just nesting different widgets which has different attributes into each other to create the UI that you want. As you can see here, this is a padding widget, which only functionality is adding padding to its child. Then we have the text widget, which only concern is rendering text within a certain style with a certain font size. So the components are really small and don't have much logic in it, which make them also easier to comprehend. Usually if you have like Android or iOS development, sometimes logic starts to leak into the UI part of your application just because it's easier to do it quickly, but that's not really handy, because then in the end you have a UI site on your application that's really large, containing all different kinds of logics just to handle the data. And with this, in this way, you can really make those small components and also make them testable easier without having to start your app. You can just write a unit test for this widget and then execute that unit test. And then you just know that this works, versus having to do tests on devices, running the app, going to the screen, checking if everything is all right, which takes a lot longer. Of course, if you create an app, usually it doesn't stay in the same state as you start the app with. So they also have a stateless widget, or a stateful widget, which gets rebuilt every time the state of the data gets updated. And basically it executes the build function every time you call setState and change the isVisible data field. Also, Flutter also has a really great way of creating things for developers. They are compared to, for instance, iOS. If you do iOS development, Apple doesn't really work for developers. They work for users really great, but for developers they're kind of meh. Google is, in that sense, a bit better. If they have software for developers, they try to make that experience really easy. So getting started with development is really easy. You already have like a fully fledged IDE that supports it. They've created plugins for the IDE. Getting the SDK on your system is also really easy. It's just this is actually the old way, cloning the Git repo. Now they have an actual installer for it, and then you run it in the command line, and it actually tells you what steps you need to take to get everything set up, versus having to read all kinds of documentation. It just pulls everything in your system. If you have Android Studio or IntelliJ installed, if you have the plugin installed, if you need to update things, they already built that into their SDK to help developers get set up and make it easy for them to start. I'm going to show a small demo of an app that I created for just looking at how Flutter works. Let's see how that looks on the screen. It's now compiling the application and then installing it on the simulator. And this should work. I've created a little demo app with the movie database, getting all the Star Wars movies, then showing a grid list of it, and then you can click on the item and then it goes to a detail screen. Basically, this is a really simple app to create. But you already see some small things like the animation of the images to each other and going back to the previous screen, which are all iOS things. But I haven't written any code to check if this is an iOS device or see that I need to do certain things for iOS or Android. I can run the exact same app on Android. Which basically looks quite the same because it's the material design. But it is an Android app with the back arrow on top. Here there's a different icon which is used for iOS. You can also share the movie, which is a fully native part which is expected on the platform. And on iOS you also have something similar. And then you can share the movie with somebody. Everything that has been written here doesn't take into mind that it's either iOS or Android. You could, of course, if you would want to make some distinction in that, but mostly you want to create a design for your brand, which is your brand, and it isn't the iOS brand or the Android brand. So you can go any way you want to go and only have to write it once. Another big thing of developing in Flutter is that this actually allows you to reload your application in half a second. If you change anything in the code, it just reloads it and you can continue working with it. This also includes if you have like a form with 6 pages deep and you filled in every page and the last page has an error. Usually it crashes, you have to fix it, go back to your application, go through all the steps again and then see if it's fixed. With this, they can just reload that single page and all the state is still in the same way. So you can see immediately if it's been fixed. I can show this in this app only a little because it doesn't have that advanced stuff. For instance, if we want to change the text color of the title, usually we would have to restart the entire app, reinstall it, which takes a few seconds up to a minute sometimes. Green. No. It's the only thing, if you have 2 devices running, you don't know which one it is. Basically, it just reloads the app. It only installs the code that has been changed, so they don't have to reinstall the entire app. That's why it's so fast.
What would happen if there was a problem in your state? Would you then have to redo everything, or is there also a way to work on
Actually, there are some really interesting tools in Dart already, which allow you to record the entire state and then step back and go forward again, which you get out of the box. For instance, React Native also has those offers, but you would have to use a certain architecture to achieve that, versus Dart offers that out of the box.
Is that because it builds every new state, so it remembers previous builds?
What do you mean?
Well, you said it remembers state. So you can step out of your step back into your state. And you also mentioned earlier that whenever your state changes, when you have a stateful widget,
Yeah.
it rebuilds your widget every time you've changed state.
Yeah.
So it doesn't keep like a tree of states that it has built over.
It keeps a tree of widgets, and so it only redraws the node that has been changed then. So therefore it's also very fast in rendering the UI. Instead of having to redraw the entire screen, it just has to do that small part of the screen that is changed. And depending on how complex your UI is, that can be the entire screen or just a small part of the screen. You do have to keep in mind a little bit about how you compose it, but it's not that really hard to do.
Seeing as well, I'm asking a question anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So do you need to keep in mind how you lay out your widgets in the way that there's no interaction between them, or that there is?
Between the widgets, usually you could keep those stateless or stateful, and you inject the state into it. So you would have to create something in your controller side that can manipulate or update the state, and then you can either provide that controller to your widget, or there's actually another powerful thing built in, because they also use reactive streams. You have widget builders which can take in a stream, and on every event they just rebuild that widget. So you just have to subscribe to a stream or pass the stream to that widget, and it gets subscribed, and then it updates the UI for you. Lucas had a question?
So you showed the widgets and how widgets generally don't have the business logic, but can you show some business logic in this one also? Where does it live?
Sure. Yeah, here this is just a simple API service which does an API request and then returns the result. This is all based on futures, so it's async. It just executes the method and then you'll wait for it. Let's see where this one is used. So here in the main screen we have a widget which is a future builder. So you pass in the future and you specify which widget to build, and then it builds the widget according to what the future returns for you. So you can check the state of the connection, and depending on that change you can update your widget.
Why are you caching the widget?
Why am I... because this is a endless scrolling list, so the widget is already created, but then we just need to update the movies that's being added for the next page.
Wouldn't it be a Google widget for an endless scrolling list?
There probably are already libraries that offer endless scrolling lists. And this was built, I think, 4 or 5 months ago. At the time, they weren't really that big already. So this is all self-built and just trying things out. There are still some issues, for instance, that loading, it reloads some widgets and then just continues. But yeah, there are small issues that can be fixed and can be done better, but the basic gist of it is how it should work. Yeah.
What are the lowest versions of iOS and Android that you can build for?
I think Android all the way down to either 14 or API 19, which is already 19 is Android 4 and 14 is Android 3.5 or something. So that's quite low. And iOS, I think they do like the 2 latest versions and the current version. So what you usually expect for iOS apps. Yeah.
So you mentioned that you can, if you're like a big brand, you can go nuts and create your own UI style basically.
Yeah.
Which is pretty awesome. But what happens when you forget something? Is there a guarantee that you cover the entire UI spectrum, or do you get flaky fails on iOS if you forget something?
No. You don't have the issue that, for instance, if somebody on Samsung decides Comic Sans is a great font for the entire device, your app still has the font that you decide, because Flutter Under the Water doesn't use any native part. The only thing it uses is the canvas. So you get basically the lowest part of the app is a widescreen, the entire size of your phone for both iOS and Android, and it draws everything onto that. Compared to, for instance, React Native, there are bindings to the actual UI components both on iOS and Android, which get drawn onto the screen. In the normal style, you would create a UI on iOS or Android, but the JavaScript, the React Native framework interprets that for you and lays out that UI programmatically for you.
How about accessibility then? Do the components already, do the Flutter components already have accessibility baked in like iOS?
I think they do. I haven't looked into that specifically yet, but I do know they already support accessibility quite good, but not maybe on the same level as iOS, but at least on the same level as Android, which isn't that great. You still have to go through a lot of hoops, but they do have it working. That screen is actually being read from the screen on both iOS and Android. But you probably have to think of accessibility in your UI design, group certain UI elements, stuff like that. In the back there was some question.
I have another question.
Yeah.
In the tagline it also said it builds for Android, iOS, and web.
Yeah.
I haven't heard anything about web yet, because if that's also good, then this might be killer.
Yeah, the web part, they've just introduced that, I think, 2.5 months ago. Basically, they've already been using Dart for quite a long time, so they're able to, if you write Dart code, there's a Dart2.js compiler which generates JavaScript for you. And they're currently working into creating the Flutter all the way down to either Canvas API or JavaScript API to render everything for the web. There are already technical previews on how to do that, but there's nothing final on how they are actually going to do that. There are still some issues, for instance, with SEO, that you have to create the whole HTML page which a crawler should be able to read. But
it sounds more like they're creating another JavaScript framework, whereas I think they might be better off doing those widgets to web components or something.
no, they actually, there might be underlying a web component which renders the things in web component, or an actual canvas or something like that.
Still working on it.
But they're still working on it. There's currently a technical preview which is forked from the main project where they do all the work in, and then I think now they're already looking into how to forking that back. There's also a desktop application thing that they're creating, which the web part is also built on top of. So you could, in theory, also create a desktop application. I think the first app that actually already has been ported from Flutter to the web has already been done in a few hours. But there's a blog post somewhere on Medium about it. Yes?
Regarding the last question, do you know if maybe they're rendering to Canvas or maybe WebGL for speed reasons? Because I understood that if you don't have the regular DOM, you can do way better, mostly now on mobile and stuff.
Yeah. For the web part, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's still the thing that they are trying to figure out. What's the best thing to use? Do they create an entire DOM, or do they just use a Canvas API and create a shadow DOM or something, or use CSS things? But that's still in development. That's really pre-alpha, but they are working on it. I think if there are no many more questions. Not yet. That's something I want to do. Out of the box, there's already great documentation on how to set something up. And it also should, in theory, work. I've read some blog posts about already doing screenshots of a certain widget in a certain state and then comparing that to a sample that you've created previously. Those things should work right out of the box. If you look, there's already a test folder which is part of the project template which you get. You can probably just right-click it, run, and then it should work already. So it shouldn't be any different than just creating unit tests.
Yeah, so what happens if there's a new version of iOS and the look and feel what will change?
Then it's up to the Flutter team to change all their UI components, which they are actively doing. But one of the great things about iOS and Android is it's not like tomorrow there's going to be a new version and nobody knows how it looks. It's actually beta and alpha tests already quite a long while ahead. So they do have time if some things change that they can update it accordingly. And I think they actually know that if they want to succeed in being a really good framework, that is the effort they have to put into it. But it's also, you can also, if you know something yourself, you can create it for yourself already. Okay, I think that's the last question, or?